Hi everyone, we're back again and it's time for us to start thinking about how we're going to start adding some watercolour to our little sketch of our cupcake. We've got to look really carefully at our source image before we start, so make sure you've got it close by at all times. We've got our really pale drawing, we've also got our water, our little palette of paints, we've got some scrap paper to blot with, we've got some tissues, and we've got 3 pointy soft brushes, a small one, a medium one, and a large one. Or if you've only got 2, that's okay. And here's my drawing. It's really pale because I rubbed it back with the rubber last lesson, remember? We're going to make a start. Now, the first thing we need to do is get our medium or our large brush, and we're going to start on the largest part of our cupcake. So whatever part is the largest, plainest sort of area on yours is where you should also start. So this is actually the cakey part of my cupcake, and it's quite textured, and I guess the top of the outer layer of this section has got quite a bit of detail if you think about the cakey kind of details, but they're all the same color. They're just different tones. Some of them are dark and some of them are lighter. So that's okay. So that's where I'm going to start. Now I work up my color so that I get a really lovely intense loading of paint onto my brush. I count to 15 when I load my brush for that with that paint. And then I dip back in the water, and now I'm starting to actually work from my darkest area. Now, the reason why I'm starting from my darkest area is not because I want it to stay dark, but because it means that I can spread this one dip of paint that I've done onto my palette all the way across to the lightest tones. Because we know that when we start a watercolor painting, we want it to be as light as the lightest tone that we have to end up with at the end. And if we go too dark over the entire thing, we are not going to ever be able to get that light tone back. So if we start off moving across to the lightest tone, that way our paint will spread out. And you can always dab back at those darker bits to make them lighter if they're worrying you or you think that they're too dark. Remember that a painting, a watercolor painting or any kind of painting, is never just one layer. It's always multiple layers on top of each other. And that's the beauty of painting. You can keep working into it and working into it to improve upon it and perfect upon it and make it the way that you want it to be. So this is just going to be the very first layer of the cakey part of my cupcake. At the moment, I'm still just moving those colors across and making sure that I am dipping back into the water and spreading. I'm actually going in a certain direction that to me suggests the way that the light is moving across my source image to give me that 3-dimensional shape, where I want the lightest tone to be kind of towards the middle right of this little kind of sausage shape that I've coloured in. And you can see how I'm dabbing the lightest tone back into that area where I want it to be lighter and leaving it darker near the edge where the shadow is actually showing on my source image. I've also dabbed in the tissue in a kind of crunched way, so that crunchy kind of textured surface of the image can give me a bit of a cakey texture, and I'm going to use some salt to give me that salt texture later on as well. But what you can do is make sure you look at your paint experiments that you did earlier in the term, and you can remember how you actually achieved those and think about, well, what's going to be best for my cupcake painting? What do I need to do? I'm now going into my second layer, and my page is still quite wet. And that's okay because I'm just going in for another layer onto my wet on wet surface. So I'm actually using a bit of the same color paint, but I'm using a smaller brush. And then I get my bigger brush, which just has water on it, plain water, and I start to move those little bits of the painted areas into the middle. And what I'm doing is I'm trying to replicate that kind of textured cakey surface that I can see in my image. So I bring in my small to medium brush that's loaded with paint. I actually put some of that paint down onto the painting, and then I add some more, and I sort of use like a little speckly, swirly kind of movement with the end of the brush. It's quite fast and it's quite kind of circular to try and get that texture. And then I go back in with my bigger brush and I move it around so that it's not as intense, because I don't want it to be too dark. See how I'm still trying to get a variation in tone? And then while it's quite wet, I'm going to put the salt in. Remember, the salt takes a long time to dry, so you have to be ready to let this dry once you've done the salt. I've got that light part from the kind of middle part of the painting over to the right hand side, and I'm going to keep working on that even though I've started to put some salt down. But I'm going to be really careful to try not to get the salt mixed in with the paint that I'm putting down, because that just starts to make a bit of a mess. So again, I've got my loaded up bright brush, which I'm then pushing down into those shadowy little bits of the top of the patty cake paper, which I can see in my image is quite dark, and then I'm moving it around with a bit of water on my brush, giving it that speckly kind of look, and then I add a little bit of water back into it and speckle it around a little bit more. It's a different movement of the brush that I was doing in that first layer. It's much more precise and kind of pointed rather than sweeping, which is what I was doing with that first lighter layer that I was putting on, which was more of just like an underpainting or a kind of coverage. Make sure you don't leave those dark bits too long, otherwise they'll dry. They dry very quickly, and once they've dried, you can't really move them around. And that's what you want to be able to do with watercolor. You want to be able to move it around. Here's some more salt coming in on that middle part now. And then I'm going to just fix that last little white bit by adding a little bit of a darker tone into that as well. Because even though it's light, it still does need that same texture that's going to be created through the use of the salt, which we know sucks the colour out of the, almost like a bleach. It almost bleaches it out of the page, so you get these little white dots. Doesn't work if your page is dry, so that's why it's really good to use with the wet on wet technique.